Alright, so we've done energy, food chain, food webs, carbon cycle, water cycle, population size, biotic factors, abiotic factors, primary succession, secondary succession, greenhouse effect, environmental effects on biomes, invasive species, slightly, and now we're going to take a look at application of all of these concepts into an aquatic system. More specifically, we'll be talking about a marine system. So you see here, if you remember this picture of the water cycle, you have land and you have ocean, and water goes up into the atmosphere and comes back down, sometimes into the ocean and sometimes off the landmass. We're going to start this off by looking at what happens in the landmass. The reason why I'm starting off with the landmass is because even though, yes, it's not part of the ocean, it does, however, have an effect on the ocean. So, let's move that up there a little bit. All that precipitation coming out from the sky goes onto land, and it moves down towards the lower levels, so off the mountain, off the hills, and eventually it might gather up in rivers and lakes and streams. And as it does that, it picks up the soil and the nutrients in the soil, so it's just moving substances into the ocean. And the ocean picks it up. And that allows productivity in the coastal areas because that brings in the nutrients, not necessarily carbon, but the nitrogen and the phosphorus that is available, that is needed for life to build themselves. Remember, all our cells, cho, chan, and chomp, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are not as readily available, even though CO2 does come in and out of the ocean from the atmosphere. So that is available, but other stuff isn't, and that other stuff is usually carried on in by the water. So now you have the nutrients in the water, and you'll also have the sun, and that shines onto the water as with everywhere else on this planet, except for the deep zones, but for photoautotrophic life. So that photoautotrophic life absorbs the sunlight, grows, replicates, limited by the amount of nutrients that's available and by predators in the water that might eat them, say a copepod. Okay. Sorry, it's a little hard to draw. But say a copepod. The copepods will then ingest these particles. I don't know if I can move them very easy, so I'll just draw them in. They'll ingest these particles, and that becomes part of the copepod. Then the copepod might get eaten by other things, say a small fish. Let's do it this way. Small fish. That goes into the fish, becomes part of the fish. And then that fish is in turn, these are primary consumers, eaten by a larger fish. Probably larger than that, but you get the idea. And then maybe by a shark. Okay. Let's see if I can do this one. Fin. Pectoral fin. Eye. Okay, it's a happy shark. Now, if you go back to what I've described in other lectures, this is giving you a rough food chain. Now, of course, there are multiple species of fish, and sharks will eat from multiple levels. So if you add all those food chains together, remember, you get a food web. But what I just described mostly occurs in the top layers because, yes, you have the sun, but as you get deeper in the water, the light gets absorbed, and it gets darker and darker, and less light is available until you get into the depths. For any of you who've seen Dory, you just keep swimming down to the Marianas Trench, and it's dark at the bottom. No light goes there, which means you can't have any photosynthetic organisms there, which means you don't have the regular circle of life of producer being eaten by a primary consumer, being eaten by a secondary, tertiary, and sometimes quaternary consumer. Now, when it's floating up on top, all those nutrients can be cycled. Goes around and around and around from life to life to life, gets decomposed, gets recycled, But sometimes stuff falls down into the areas where you have no primary production. And then eventually it silts up, collects on the bottom, and more collects on the bottom and compacts it until you have a thick layer. And eventually that goes to subduction zones, and this is into geology, subduction zones, and sometimes you get uplift occur, and then that gets moved back up into mountain layers, and that's why you have marine fossils on top of mountain ranges. Is those areas used to be oceans, and the plate just got moved up. So, and now all those nutrients are available again to be washed down of mountains back into the oceans, and the process repeats. Now, the problems that I described in previous lectures are all prevalent and can happen in marine and aquatic ecosystems as well. For example, if you have an invasive, say the lionfish, I'm putting it up here for now, it's not in the water, it's actually in the water, it will outcompete other fish for the prey, and as well, because all these spines on the lionfish inject a toxin, not a lot of things are going to be able to eat this successfully and survive, which means that they are no longer limited to predation, and that nixes all the upper level predators. So they have come into the system and they have disturbed it, knocked out the other occupants of that niche, and it prevents others from the higher trophic levels from consuming them. So that can have impacts on the ecosystem, for the others actually do ecosystem functions, and then also you're reducing the amount of diversity. Another problem is that if you have farmland, well, in order to keep the farm productive, you have to keep on adding fertilizer so that all the plants will have all the nutrients and all the atoms, molecules that they need in order to stay alive, in order to grow. But with a lot of fertilization, we tend to over-fertilize the land, which means all that extra fertilizer gets carried away with the water, and then it might run into the rivers, and the rivers run into the ocean, and then the ocean gets a whole bunch of fertilizer. So fertilizing a farm crop is good because you get more plants that way, but if you fertilize the ocean, you tend to produce a lot more algae, and that can have a lot of problem in marine ecosystems. For one thing, some of you might have heard of paralytic shellfish poisoning, PSPs, and that occurs because there is an algal bloom, and this particular algae produces a neurotoxin, which does not affect clams. But if we eat the clams that have eaten those particular algae, then we get those neurotoxins, and it's not very good for us. It can kill you. So that's one thing. Another thing is, if you remember this equation, so let's see, CO2 plus O2 gets you H2O, sorry about that, gets you C6H12O6 plus O2. If you remember this fact, remember all these plants, even though they are doing photosynthesis, which is going this way, they are still doing cell respiration, which is going the other way. So at night, it's going to the other direction, which means it's using up a lot of oxygen in the water, which means sometimes it's to the point where it's using up all the oxygen in the water, and it kills off any animals that cannot survive low oxygen. A further problem is that if you do it enough, you can change systems that are used to low amounts of nutrients, say a wonderful, beautiful coral reef. Ain't that a pretty picture? It's what brings a lot of tourism down to Florida. If you add too many nutrients, then it gives a competitive advantage to algae, and this is what you get instead. Not so pretty. Many people will come down to Florida or to any of the other coral reefs just to see this mess. So we have impact. changes with the things that we do can change the environment, and we've just walked through an example of one environment where all these impacts that we've been talking about for this lecture series can occur. All right. Take care. Hope you enjoyed the video.